The things I would recommend, first off, is review your GRC platform. What are you using? How are you using it? Is it actually working? Have you actually employed it the way it's intended to be employed? One of the worst things you can have happen is an auditor walk in, audit you, and your policies say one thing and you do another, right? You're not following your policies. So make sure your GRC is current and up to date. Bring your SOPs current and document your changes. Memorializing your status checks, your log checks, your annual policy review, your annual updates. By memorializing that, you can give that to the auditor, and the auditor will now have evidence that they need to pass you through the audit, right? Also, it's just great cybersecurity practice to actually understand what you've done, where you've done it, and that you're constantly monitoring and updating and improving your organization.
Hello, and welcome to the State of Security podcast. I'm Jeff Hancock, the host. Today, we're going to be discussing governance and resilient GRC for all organizations, large and small. Our guests today are Rick Leib. Rick is the Senior Director and CISO Advisor for Access Point Consulting, where he works with many different CISOs across a variety of industries, talking just about this topic, operationalizing GRC. As well as we have Susan Woyton. Susan has got many years as a principal cybersecurity consultant across a handful of different organizations specializing in GRC. Thank you both for joining our podcast today. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Thanks.
Sure thing. So, as this is just our casual conversation that we like to have usually once a week, helping people understand different topics and issues, both on the cyber operations side, the business and compliance side, and then just the business of cybersecurity. As we talked before, the three of us, what's the basics of resilient GRC? And I know, Susan, you had some notes and comments about that. So I'll start out with you.
Sure thing. So having a resilient GRC program is very important for organizations to achieve a healthy cyber hygiene and to optimize their governance, risk, and compliance as it relates to their business processes and as it relates to how they have to comply with certain regulatory standards, laws and regulations. For instance, government entities have to have a whole host of regulatories and laws that they have to adhere to, insurance companies as well. So it's very important to know those particular things that you have to comply with, and making sure that there is leadership support. So making sure that the executive leadership in the company knows what the organization has to do and their objectives to meet this. Also, that these having the right strategies communicated throughout the entire organization is important too, making sure that all of the employees, contractors, third parties are aware of the different regulatory standards that the company must adhere to. So having a great training and awareness program is very important as well. And then as far as, security, you definitely would want to make sure that that your contracts are in order, that because your contracts are one of the most important governance tool that you have, because they state the level of service commitment. And if it's not in the contract, then it doesn't exist.
So question.
Yes.
So let me ask you a question there. So
Sure.
from a contract perspective, right, in your experience in helping organizations implement GRC, have you seen like in specifics where in contracts they're saying, if I'm working with you, Mr. Company, Mrs. Company, and I'm like providing a service to you in your business, et cetera, have you seen in the contracts spell out the need for some sort of meeting a GRC compliance requirement? Have you seen that spelled out in a contract before, or have you seen it really focus around the audit's coming. We need to get ready. Let's do the audit and kind of go down that path. I'm curious what you've experienced.
Well, I've seen contracts that do have the GRC specifications in there. For instance, if it's a heavily regulated industry, for instance, a bank, they have to adhere to a lot of regulations.
Yeah.
So they need to specify in their contracts that are, if you're going to contract with me, then you need to meet these requirements.
Sure.
And if you don't, then we'll need to maybe have an exception or
Yep.
or document that in a risk register, and then keep following up on that
Yep.
regularly to see if maybe it could be mitigated, or if eventually the risk will be something that'll just go away. But
Yep.
I have seen it both in there, and I've seen it nothing in there regarding GRC, which is I always recommend that those specifications are in a contract for sure.
I bet. I think it really makes me wonder as well, from in being in cyber operations, right? I've always had that. You've always had to balance the GRC requirements from an audit perspective, et cetera. So I was just curious if how you've seen that played out before in your experience, because sometimes GRC is overlooked, and Rick, I've talked about that before. People are just running and gunning and trying to operationalize cybersecurity. And on the other side, you see it, we can't do anything until the GRC is lined out in detail, and then you can figure out how to operationalize it. And I think there's you can't have one without the other, and you can't just do one or the other. You've got to really combine them to get it to working well. So I was curious your experience in that. So cool. Appreciate it.
Sure.
What's in your experience, where have you seen it go sideways? Like where a company just totally missed the boat when it came to, oh yeah, now we have to be compliant, or we have to make sure our partners are compliant.
I've seen where companies have neglected to make sure things are like that in their contracts. For instance, maybe companies that are contracting with an MSP, and they need to know what the MSP does with their data, where it's stored, and things of that nature, and who may have access to it, if they're on a public, or if they have private cloud, or if they're public, and what other companies are sharing some of the same regions and tenants that that they are. So that's very important to know as well, in order to keep your data safe. So
sounds like Change Healthcare, right?
Yeah.
Honestly,
exactly.
I mean, data was everywhere, right? So how do you?
Yeah, exactly. And then nobody, it's all over the place, and nobody knows how to put parameters around it, when it's too late. So.
Yep. Rick, what are your thoughts on GRC and operationally?
I've seen organizations where we've actually gone into to help out with one thing, right? So we'll go in to do a security audit for like a risk assessment, something along those lines, and find out that they're not following compliance, that their GRC is not up to par. And the company sometimes may think that they are up to par, and you have to sometimes, as a consultant, explain where your GRC is failing and the importance of why you want a resilient GRC, because during these failures, you've got to have your GRC running and operational. You've got to have everybody understanding it. You've got to have all the different support. You got to have all the different policy procedures in place, et cetera. But where you find organizations that don't have a solid GRC or a good resilient GRC. So when something's going sideways, if they don't have a resilient GRC, they don't know what's going on, right? They don't have their SOPs. They don't have all of their standard regulatory requirements that they've got to start meeting while they're actually undergoing an incident. So I've seen a little bit on both. But back to the contracting side, I've seen more and more lately now that the contracts are starting to have some teeth and actually start now showing we're now seeing some contracts actually to the point to where they actually have penalties in the contracts now. So if the company is not compliant, or the company is breached because they failed to be compliant, there's a penalty for it. So I'm starting to see a lot more of those these days.
Yeah, I have too, especially in light of the SEC ruling where they're requiring organizations, publicly traded companies, to have some level of cybersecurity program that they adhere to. And as soon as an organization says, yes, we adhere to this, or we adhere to this this framework or this governance, they have to show the evidence thereof.
Absolutely.
The challenge, I think, has been companies just show an audit. Yeah, a year ago, I checked the box.
They go for checkpoint compliance, unlike where you got like a SOC 2 or an ISO, where you've got ongoing maintenance, you've got ongoing proof. You've got to maintain or prove that you're maintaining your cybersecurity program as it's written. So yeah, no, I agree with you. I've seen a lot of that as well. Compliant, and that's where you become compliance-driven GRC, right? That's not where you actually become company concerned with GRC, where the company is the first. And your business is the first line of defense here, or is the first thought in your GRC. Now it's just compliance. Do we meet the auditor's needs? Can we make them go away? Because GRC is seen as a burden by many organizations, right? Yeah. And that's the truth. I mean, it does feel like a burden in some organizations because the way it's run, or they don't understand GRC and where it plays a role in their organization and how it can actually help them be profitable by deferring costs such as fines, lost customers, reputation.
So from a customer's perspective, right? I think there's a lot of misunderstanding regarding what companies need to be apply, what regulations need to apply to different companies. I mean, there's 50 states in our country, and there's 51 data security laws by state, one by state, and some are very similar. I think there's only like 7 that are exactly the same, and the rest are very different. So as a company, if I'm working and sharing data and information across states, just trying to be compliant with that is crazy, let alone if I'm providing data to a healthcare organization, or I'm taking data from a healthcare organization and then I'm processing that through my third parties. It can get crazy, right? I mean, and it's gotten worse over the years, I think, at least in my experience working with customers, and it's gotten worse than gotten better, which still has me scratching my head because, there are a lot of organizations that would like to mandate certain requirements from companies. FTC did one a few weeks ago. SEC we talked about earlier. DHS is now would like to try to. They haven't yet, but they may be requiring companies to follow a certain process when it comes to monitoring breaches, when it comes to sharing incident response information. So there's a lot more oversight that's a concern for a lot of organizations from a customer's perspective. What have you guys seen from a customer's point of view, whether it be great alignment examples, or misunderstandings of, well, I'm compliant for this and that should cover me for that, right? We're all good. What have you guys seen? I'm curious. And the application of AI, machine learning, large language models, and what that may impact as well.
I've seen a lot of companies now actually starting to actually understand what the TPRM, third party risk management, actually looks like and what it really means. We're starting to see more and more of that. And now the companies that actually do that very well, which there are only a few, a lot of companies think they do it really well. Not as many do it as great as they think they do, but a lot of them do it very well. So some of the companies that actually do it very well are now doing fourth party risk management. And that's where I think your future is going to get to. I think we're going to get down to fourth party. I think we're going to figure out third party in the next 5 years, 3 years, and get it down to a science. And then I think we're going to be moving on to fourth party. But I've seen a lot of third parties now, companies taking third party risk management extremely seriously because their supply chain is under attack at all times. Plain and simple. And without their supply chain, the company has difficulties. They can't produce data. They can't produce a product. They can't ship something. They can't do logistics, what have you. Sorry, I lost it.
No, you're right. I get it. There's a lot of that intersection that needs to be considered. I don't think people are thinking fourth party. Susan, what do you think?
I agree for sure. Fourth party is something that is definitely on the rise. And Rick is right. It's very hard for companies to build a good third party risk program because they're so focused on their operations. They don't think about how other organizations impact or how they actually touch their data. So coming from a banking background, I worked at a couple banks before, and just knowing all the different vendors that impact one particular bank it's really phenomenal. And just having the bank I worked for had a whole ridiculously huge third-party risk management program, and they had people who were contacts at all of the vendors, and they constantly were updating SOC reports or doing questionnaires, security questionnaires. It's a continuous 365-day a year effort in order to protect your data, and knowing who has access to it. So for sure, it's a whole podcast in and of itself. I have to say.
I bet. So I think one of the comments you'd made earlier about GRC increasing or improving operational efficiency. What do you have an example of that, or additional thoughts around that? Because I think a lot of companies think GRC is a one and done. And then what you just explained in your example, some organizations, if banks are big enough, right, it's GRC all day, every day. Right? So they've got to stay on top of it. But is there an intersection there, or something that you've experienced, where an example of how GRC can improve the operational efficiency, but then any recommendation for the smaller, mid-sized companies that aren't like a financial example you gave earlier?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is a GRC. It's intertwined with everything. So I think what comes to mind first for me is a good vulnerability management, where a company is constantly looking at their patching efforts and how they go about doing that, and maybe having an automated tool that just kind of alerts on any kind of changes that are made to the systems, unauthorized changes, things of that nature. Just doing continuous monitoring and making sure that you document your baselines, your configuration baselines. That's got to be done continuously too. So that's just one small part of it, but there's a whole host of other things that touches on GRC.
So a vulnerability management program clearly is a feeder, if you will, into a solid GRC program. In
Yes,
what you're
it
saying.
is. Yes,
Yeah,
it
I don't
is.
think a lot of people see them in silos. So that's why I'm kind of bringing that out. Is it just doesn't seem to be a functional thing people think about. GRC, give me the document. I'll go ask 1,000 questions and get back to you in 2 weeks, and we're done, right? So
Right. Yeah.
without thinking through those threats, and I think that's what's an interesting point. So go ahead, Rick.
I'm glad you just hit my exact point, Jeff. We're good.
Okay, cool. Sorry.
No. It's okay. Appreciate it.
He stole your thunder.
Yeah. So on the cyber threat piece, right? So if I'm a GRC expert in a company, and my sole job is to make sure all of the company's main core compliance issues are aligned. That's one aspect. That's more of a snapshot window in time, independent review. Susan, you brought out the dependency on vulnerability function within an organization to be able to make sure that the GRC manager, director, whomever has the right data so they can operationalize security. What other areas or disciplines do you guys think people don't think about or miss? If you're a GRC expert in a company and you're focused on just making sure all the data is compliant, what about vulnerability? Like you said, what about vulnerability? What about threat intelligence? What about supply chain, right? These are different elements. And I think people don't necessarily think of it in a holistic way. Again, they think of cybersecurity as just this one thing, or GRC as this one swim lane.
So I find just the fact that getting a GRC understood what it really means to the executive level helps, right? So when they start understanding, excuse me, the GRC now operationalizes their threat intelligence, operationalizes their risk analysis, and how that ends up making them more money by working with the clients better, right? Or not getting HIPAA violations for releasing data, right? Ransomware attacks, phishing, social engineering attacks, right? These are all part of these all go back to your GRC, right? So if you have a solid governance, risk, and compliance program that's applied across the board and supported by the executives, 80% of these breaches, if you will, or breaches of trust go away. If you tie that with the technology, the tools to support that executive level support for your GRC program, 80 to 90% of your breaches are gone. They don't happen. They can't happen because now you've got a solid IAM. You have solid IAM. You've got a solid RBACs for every single role in the company, right? So maybe a data analyst needs access to this, but a compliance analyst does not. So why on earth does a compliance analyst have this access? If you have a great GRC program that's actually practiced and implemented well and followed up on regularly, these things don't happen because now your GRC team or your policy team are now following up with your internal audit team.
Yeah.
To make sure that all these things happen. And I also find that the smaller organizations who can't afford all these teams, right? Because let's just be honest, right? GRC is expensive, it's big, it's voluminous. A lot of smaller and mid-sized organizations actually benefit from bringing in a third-party consultant to help them get their ducks in a row. Yeah, it might cost a little bit more up front because you've got a bunch of man hours up front, but once you have a solid basis and you've got the support of the executives, moving forward should be a lot less expensive. And bringing that third party in can actually help the smaller companies get to that point.
Yep.
I totally agree. It becomes a well-oiled machine once you have the basics in there and you train everybody, this is what we need, oh, we have a new process. Oh, we need to document that process. Are our policies up to date? Are we following our policies? Do we have, if we are documenting standards, do we have those up to date? So all that comes into play. And once everything is the basis is set, then it's just working on optimizing from then on. So it becomes a lot more efficient.
What other disciplines have you seen are critical to the success of GRC? You mentioned vulnerability is one. Like, have you seen any other aspects of cybersecurity that really make the GRC function particularly successful?
I think security training is definitely one. Doing, regular phishing exercises, making sure people are, if you put out security videos, teaching people how to make sure that they log off their computer when they walk away. They don't write their passwords on a Post-it note, and they don't respond to emails that are from someone they don't know or outside the company that they don't know are being sent. So
it seems like again, it boils down, there's certainly the human threat piece. And if GRC can be used, compliance portion of your program as a company can be used to not wrap knuckles, but coach people gently on how to make sure that they need to log off and not store their passwords on a sticky, right? I remember, as a side note here, a couple of years back, there was volcanoes in Hawaii that were erupting, causing lots of damage. And they interviewed the mayor, and behind the mayor in an office space, and behind the mayor was a bunch of cubicles and such. And you saw a person sitting at a desk and a monitor, and you've got all of these stickies that have their passwords on every single piece of it. And you're like, wow, okay, thank you, right? And somebody took a screenshot of that and posted that broadly on social media saying, this is a problem, right? How many people do this and not think about it, right? So it's a good point, right? I think, GRC is as important as the operational components of cybersecurity. And I mean like hands on keyboard, running socks, that kind of thing, the engagement model, if you will. I think both of those things have to work very collaboratively. And I think people still see them as parts and pieces of the same thing, disparate silos that should work together but don't really, and people aren't sure of how to use a GRC program, which is why I was asking about the vulnerability piece and that function feeding into a GRC program. And now obviously security awareness and training feeding into that to help secure your business. There's definitely for an overused term, teamwork that's needed in making that successful. So absolutely.
Also, running continual threat evaluation and monitoring always helps too, because if your GRC is set up right, you're actually using the right tools, you're doing the right processes, right? So now when you're doing continual threat, and evaluation and monitoring, now that you take that data and you feed it right back into your GRC process. So where do we improve, right? That's part of that continual improvement, right? How do we improve? So if you got a great GRC and you've got a good resilient GRC, because resilience matters when an incident hits, right? So if your GRC system disappears, how do you know what to do? You got to practice it, right? You've got to take and learn from those things. You got to implement those into your GRC platforms, such as keeping your security logs in a separate system. Because if ransomware gets in and encrypts your system, well, without the logs, you have no idea how it got in or where to start from.
Right.
Really, it just becomes very difficult, right?
Yep.
That poor security engineer is not going to sleep for a month, So I find things like that, like implementing it, and take that constant, evaluation and monitoring, and take that and apply it to your incident response plan, right? And your GRC drives all of that. So implement your GRC, or implement your risk assessments, put your vulnerability management, run it into your IR plans, make sure that your DR plans are updated. It also, and by the time you get done with all of this, it drives your business continuity plan to be updated and more current as well, and adopted.
Yeah. Agreed. And I think you made a point earlier too that I want to make sure we hit on is some of the small and medium-sized businesses. It's very much worth them hiring an outside consultant to come in and do a pre-assessment, if you will. If a company knows they are now bound and required to comply with a certain compliance frameworks or assessments, and they don't have the staff to come in and figure it out, they don't have the staff to test it, to make sure it all works, it is so valuable to be able to have someone come in and not just, I'm going to step on toes here for some of the people, I'm sure, not just provide the customer a book and say, there you go, thank you very much, have a good day. But actually those companies need someone or a team of people to come in and say, we're going to come in, sit down with you, help you make sure your GRC compliance requirements are met, but then how are you going to manage those going forward for the next year so that when you get an audit, I'm already implementing these compliance pieces within my program, and you can point to that during the audit. I think that's such a key piece that so many small businesses miss. And I understand why, because it's just a cost model, right? Do I have to spend $200,000 to have somebody come in and do my GRC program? Well, it could save you $2 million. I mean, that's
absolutely
not a bad, and that's not unreasonable. So,
and many small organizations that cannot afford to cut corners do cut corners, right? And so they're trying to save money, but by bringing somebody in like a third party consultant that can come in and actually help them set that up, there is that bigger experience, as you mentioned, Jeff. There is that bigger cost, but up front that saves a lot of money in the back end, because now everything just runs. And I thoroughly lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry.
That's fine. That just runs, like you said.
Absolutely.
Right?
There's so much to say about GRC. It's just hard to get it all in 1 hour.
For me, it's all about, honestly, it's about the continuous monitoring, right? And improvement. That's really where it is. So your GRC, if it's set up right, has all of your policies, procedures moving, your IT staff moving, you've got your executive support, you've got all your audit frameworks, you get your internal audit team doing its thing. And all of that rolls right back into GRC to improve the GRC, which then improves all of your processes. So it really is a full circle. And if you look at it that way as an executive, now you understand how each of these pieces affect the other, which I think you alluded to earlier, Jeff, where some people think GRC, here's your book one time a year and then we're done. And it really isn't. So if you're following things like SOC 2, you're following things like ISO 27002, you actually have to prove that you're following this all year long, not like where a HIP audit will come in once a year, or a PCI and do a snapshot. Just do a snapshot in time. So now you have to prove all of this, and your good solid GRC, even for small companies, you don't have to do 85,000 steps. You can just do 10 steps, but logging it, recording it, doing the right things, the right quarter of the year is important. And bringing in a third party can help actually set that up for you and save you a lot of money in the long run.
Yep. So agreed. As these smaller companies find faster, better, more efficient business models to use things like artificial intelligence components of different products, I should say. What do you guys think about that? Right? How would AI impact GRC? How does it impact GRC from where both of you sit and what you've seen? So, Susan, you want to start with you?
Well, I don't have a lot of experience with AI as far as GRC is concerned at this point. For me personally, I
Mm-hmm.
think you will always need that human element involved with GRC. I don't think you can take a GRC and apply AI to it because to me, it's not a one size fits all. I think there always has to be some kind of human element because things are always changing. Technology changes, laws change, regulations change, frameworks are updated, and maybe AI can keep up with that. Who knows? But
Right.
For now, I think the world needs GRC,
Human enabled.
specialists. And yeah, exactly. And in an effort to make AI and GRC compatible, I guess, so to speak.
No,
So
that's a good point because I think if I'm a small business owner and I've got this great idea and I've bought this product and part of it uses AI to be able to assess whatever my business work stream is. I need to show, and then now I find out I need, an information security audit done. I need to be able to understand the crossover between is AI, would this AI product I'm using be a third party product? So then it falls into a third party GRC program assessment. Then if it is truly a third party, it's touching what data? I'm giving what data to this product, and it's the AI within the product, the machine learning within the product is processing customer data, user data, IP information from my company, massaging the information, and spitting out a result to a customer. There's a lot of different moving parts in there from a security perspective, a data perspective, where the data resides, third party. I mean, that could be pretty messy.
It can be. I think AI can definitely help your GRC process, but as Susan was alluding to, there are caveats, right? For example, no one likes to admit it, AI lies because it's based on human data, based on human bias. It hallucinates what it doesn't know. In some cases, large language models will actually start creating reality, right? And you need to make sure, to Susan's point, that human is in charge and understands that if you're using AI in your GRC, that you actually look at it. Is it accurate? Is the data it's spitting out correct? Does it apply to my organization? And then how do I utilize this data, right? How do I roll this out? How do I implement this? How do I operationalize all of that, right? So that's all critical when it comes to AI. As someone who uses AI every single day, I like AI, but I don't trust it at all.
No.
I don't put, you can't put customer data into it. You can't put any confidential data into it. When you use AI and it comes back with something for you, you've got to read every single word because grammar matters, and AI is not the most grammatical tool out there. And it will also hallucinate, which is the polite way of saying it lies because it makes up data, right? So as you apply that to your GRC program, you need to make sure that, like to Susan's point, that human actually looks at that. Does this apply? Because the last thing you would do is do a copy paste out of AI and then go running down the road, go off the horizon and go, oops.
Yeah. And with all it, again, Susan, we keep calling you out here. Your point about all the compliance changes, state, federal, local, industries crossover, all that noise. I mean, it changes too fast. It requires a human to be able to have background. I think it requires a human to have background expertise in the application of GRC. And then maybe using language models, maybe if it makes sense to some degree. But I think, I think to your point, you really have got to have people touching, looking, feeling at your GRC program. You can't really I'll just figure out I'll buy the software platform and it'll do an audit for me automatically. I'm not sure there's something out there that exists that's going to work effectively right now. And even so, again, to your point, Susan, humans are going to need to be in the loop. So
absolutely,
I think that's key. So, all right. So recommendations for strengthening GRC programs within organizations from both a strategic or executive point of view down to a tactical point of view. What do you guys think?
Number one, executive buy-in. You've got to have leadership buy into it because there's a cost involved in it. Even if it's not a cash flow cost to go buy a tool, you've still got human cost, human capital involved, right? And you've got other processes you're going to impact. So you've got to absolutely have that leadership buy-in. Absolutely. Make sure that all your policies, your SOPs are written, they're well documented, they're actually tested. Make sure it's a response plan is actually written and tested. So my opinion is just kind of go through all your documentation. Start at the top, get the buy-in, get the money, whether it be cash to purchase something or it be cash to pay somebody to do something,
Sure.
or to bring a third party in. But start at the top, do regular awareness training, get all your training done, get your documentation done, make sure your policies are done, and match those to your framework. So if you're running a CIS framework, a CIS 18 framework, or a NIST CSF framework versus maybe an ISO 27001, they're very, very different.
Yep.
They're very different. So you need to make sure your policies, your procedures, and your executives all buy into the framework that matches up. But because you always want to start at the top, plain and simple. Without executive support, you got nothing. You're wasting your time. You're wasting the company's money, efforts. So just start at the top. Make sure you got your ducks in a row. Get your policy procedures done, your SOPs done. Look at them at least once a year, sometimes twice a year. The other thing that people miss is during a major change. So if you upgrade your software platform from version 3.0 to 4.0, you need to update your GRC in this respect,
Right?
Because now things have changed. So anytime you have a major change, you need to make sure you get these updated.
What do you think, Susan?
I agree with all of that. All of that's awesome, should be done, as well as making sure that GRC elements live in your contracts and that the organization you're contracting with understands what you have to adhere to so that they have to adhere to it, and make sure if there's any exceptions that need to be called out, that those are documented and reviewed on a regular basis, making sure all SLAs and contract terms are explicitly stated, and having third-party risk management assessments done, as well as internal risk assessments for the organization, and doing regular monitoring of everything, for sure.
Huh. Yeah, well, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's like 8 things from you guys. That's great. That's great. Because I think there's, you guys know this, what we like to do is really provide very practical ways of managing security for people that are simple. So the idea here is that when people hear the podcast, they can walk away with something. Oh, I need to go look at this. Oh, I need to go look at that. Right. So it's nothing theoretical here. Only theoretical here. It's much more application. So I think that's great. I think that it's very important that people understand that GRC, again, is not a silo within the organization. It's not a person in the corner who comes out once a year and goes through their assignments and goes through their audits and gets stuff done and figured out, and they go back in their closet, right? It just doesn't work. It's important that organizations, I think, understand how to integrate all this stuff. So really good points, actually. So when I think about it here, I mean, the recommendations will be clearly looking at your GRC program and understanding, Susan, to one of your first points, vulnerability. What other elements in your organization empower your GRC program to be effective? So I would think, just from my perspective, I think that would be like the first thing, right? And then obviously, Rick, as you point out, the executive support is clearly unnecessary, and not just once a year, right? So if I'm a CISO, I need to have a business line item that says, this is my GRC program, here are the dependencies, right? The vulnerability management, the team and that data, the threat modeling information, right? What threats are is my organization particularly susceptible to? And then from an executive perspective, that's support at the board level, because without good GRC, lawsuits will happen. So that's always something that the board has to keep an eye on. But again, to the policies and procedures, the data in the contracts, right? The requirements in the contracts, document reviews across the organization, making sure who owns what data, where it flows, where it gets managed, but then also third-party assessments, security awareness training. Susan, you mentioned that earlier. I think those are also very important aspects of what the organization needs to manage. So very cool. Very cool. So as we wrap this up, what things have you not said that you want to say to people who are listening, who really are trying to figure out, where do I start? What do I make sure? I'm in the middle of doing this now. What should I make sure happens? So any thoughts there?
So the things I would recommend, first off, is review your GRC platform. What are you using? How are you using it? Is it actually working? Have you actually employed it the way it's intended to be employed, right? So one of the worst things you can have happen is an auditor walk in and audit you, and your policies say one thing and you do another, right? You're not following your policies. So make sure your GRC is current and up to date. That's the very first thing I would do. So if you don't have your policies current, bring them current. Bring your SOPs current, because these all matter, right? And document your changes. Document. I can't say that enough, because an auditor doesn't want to hear that you've done something. They want you to prove that you've done something. And by ways of memorializing your status checks, your log checks, your annual policy review, your annual updates, by memorializing that now you can give that to the auditor, and the auditor will now have evidence that they need to pass you through the audit, right? Also, it's just great cybersecurity practice to actually understand what you've done, where you've done it, and that you're constantly monitoring and updating and improving your organization.
Agreed.
I agree with all that. Definitely look at your documentation and how you're currently doing things, and making sure that it all aligns with your processes and your procedures, all align with your documentation. And if you're using 8-character password policy, then make sure that if your policy says that you have to use MFA, then you better be using MFA. So those are very, very easy things to do. I mean, GRC is not it doesn't take, it's not fast. You have to continuously work on it. So gotta keep working on it.
I appreciate it. Thanks for your time. I know Rick just had to drop, I believe, so for another urgent thing. So thank you for your time and your expertise. Appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll have you on again soon.
Awesome. Enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Yep.
Take care.
You too.